I do hope you can all hear me. Just a bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded for posterity, and also that our policy colleagues can actually take out salient points, feed them up to the British Chambers of Commerce, so on and so forth. For your information, you can see the details behind me, but I'm Sara. If you shout Sarah, my colleague Sarah, who's running the tech for me kindly in the background, she will suddenly start pressing buttons and it could all go wrong. So I'm Sara, for your information. So the premise of today's event, what we're really doing is bringing together leaders from the transport sector to explore whether government targets are possibly too ambitious regarding net zero ambitions. Is there sufficient talent coming through the pipeline into the sector? Could the inventor of a vehicle that runs on fresh air still be studying their GCSEs, or in primary school for that matter? Electrification, undoubtedly better for our air quality and the environment as it stands, but what happens when battery life runs out? And my speakers today will undoubtedly have some words around that. It occurred to me that as human beings, we're very clever at inventing stuff like plastic and diesel engines, but they're as unpopular as President Putin these days, or nearly as unpopular. The pandemic will have had an effect on how we work, where we work. Is maybe a blended mix of travel the way forward? I will now hand over to the experts. I'm no expert. I'm just kind of throwing questions out there to start the conversation. Please introduce yourself, delegates, in the chat box. If you have questions, pop them in, and if it's salient to that speaker at the time, they'll pick up on it directly. Otherwise, we will open that conversation as we come to a close. I think that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to my first expert, who's Phil Southall. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself to the audience, Phil, and you take it from here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sara, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this session. So I'm Phil Southall, I'm the Managing Director for the Go Ahead Group PLC bus companies in Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire. So the biggest one of those is Oxford Bus Company, which runs in Oxford City and runs coaches to Heathrow and Gatwick airports. Thames Travel, based in South Oxfordshire. Carousel buses based in High Wycombe, and the City Sightseeing tour buses in Oxford City. It's a quite portfolio, about 270 buses and about 700 staff. So I'm here to tell you about what's going on in the bus world, and buses really are at the centre of the public transport network. There was 4.07 billion journeys in England in 2019-2020 before COVID hit, which is more than twice as many as the railways. So no disrespect to Edward, but there seems to be an over focus on railways because more politicians use railways than use buses. But the reality is that twice as many people use buses than use the railways, which is important context for how important they are to people. They obviously bring people to jobs, study, and liberate people who are old, young, disabled. They save millions of tons of carbon and pollution and thousands of miles of traffic jams each year. But despite all of that, for decades, buses have been largely ignored by our policymakers, I have to say. Unlike rail, road, aviation, cycling and walking, there wasn't until last year, in fact, a national bus strategy. So that was announced in April last year, which the Prime Minister committed £3 billion of funding to actually improve buses, which I'll come on to shortly. But unfortunately, in the comprehensive spending review in October, that received a haircut and was reduced to 1.2 billion. So yet again, buses unfortunately are not as central as they should be, bearing in mind how many people use them. So moving on to COVID, COVID-19 has had a significant impact on buses. At the height of COVID, my patronage went down to about 6% of normal. It's now got back to about 75% of normal, but you may have seen in the press that you can't carry on running 100% of the network when you've only got 75% of the patronage. So at the moment, bus companies are on government funding to assist them out of the pandemic. But what COVID has caused, unfortunately, is a shift from public transport back to the private car. And to avoid the worst effects of a car-led recovery and cities and towns grinding to a halt more often, and more pollution and road injuries and all the respiratory illnesses that have been spoken about, we need to shift back quickly to get people back onto public transport. And that means that radical improvements to public transport are going to be required as normal life returns, or at least we hope returns. And buses are actually the easiest and quickest way to do that. The lead times are relatively short compared to other modes, and therefore the opportunities are there to be had. So, as I say, the National Bus Strategy was published in April last year, and the strategy outlines some very broad areas, and the areas you would expect really. But the strategy will make buses more frequent, more reliable, easy to understand and use, better coordinated, cheaper, and then quite often people say, well, why can't we have London style or London levels of service outside of London that you have in London? But London is not perfect either. You may have seen that the Mayor is in a bit of a debate with the government about its future funding, and actually over 250 buses have been removed from the London network in the last 12 months. So what it boils down to at the end of the day is what funding is made available to achieve the political outcomes, both locally and nationally, that our politicians wish to achieve. So, on the wish list, shall we say, in the National Bus Strategy is multimodal ticketing. So there's been £360 million made available to try and do this, which is a sort of holy grail, really. It's something that the government's tried to do for years and years, but it's very complicated, it's very complex, but there is going to be another attempt to do this shortly. Bus priority is obviously a big factor. So in Oxford, for example, on my busiest city service, in 2012, it took 72 minutes to do a round trip. At the moment, it takes 88 minutes. So you can see that over sort of 8-9 years, the journey time on those buses has got longer and longer, and that's why we need much more bus priority measures to make sure that more people are attracted to use the bus network, and we can keep cities functioning as best we can. So we want buses to be both tools of inclusion and what we call now the natural first choice is what government's saying. We want to demystify buses for non-users as well, because sometimes people look at the bus network, they see it's very complicated to use. They might have memories of what it was like to use when they perhaps travel to school on them, and things have improved massively over recent years. So we need to tackle those misconceptions about bus travel and address those negative perceptions as well. So, moving on to buses being key to delivering the wider government priorities. So buses can play a greater role in enabling access to work and getting people into more productive work. 44% of bus trips are for work or education, compared with 27% of solo car journeys. Buses can obviously help drive better employment outcomes for disabled people and cities outside London as well as London. And 77% of job seekers do not have regular access to a car, van, or motorbike, so that that's why they're critical to getting people into jobs. And having found employment, affordable bus travel helps ensure that work pays and can be sustained for everyone. Buses can be key to levelling up. Obviously, I'm sure you've all read the 332-page levelling up white paper from cover to cover, but buses are key in there as well, and that obviously improving public transport excuse me, appears as one of the 12 missions to try and get buses or public transport generally closer to London standards by 2030. But users of buses are disproportionately from less advantaged social groups and places. So improving services will strengthen communities as well, sustain town centres, as I say, connect disabled and isolated people to where they want to go. But buses definitely shouldn't be promoted as only those that must use them. I mean, in Oxford, certainly we've been very successful in making the bus appealing to those that are choosing to use the bus because they want to, not because they have to use the bus. And in fact, if you look at what we did achieve up to pre-COVID, on a weekday, 55% of people in Oxford city centre got there by bus. And that rose to 65% at the weekend. If you compare that to somewhere like High Wycombe, the comparative figure is 7%. Now, so where you can actually deliver a very high quality product that's attractive to people, easy to use, etc., people will come and use it. So To build on that, buses are vital to ensuring that our economy meets the net zero carbon emissions, as Sara alluded to in her introduction. Buses must drive the green transformation of our cities. In congested areas, we need to achieve substantial modal shift if we're going to achieve net zero targets. Because if we don't achieve that modal shift, we are just simply not going to achieve it. And we need to do more actually up to 2030 to achieve it earlier. Otherwise, it gets more difficult as time gets on. So if clean air targets and the government's broader climate goals are to be met, we must invest in more zero emission buses. And I'll come on to what Oxford's doing about that shortly. But the bus really is the only mode of transport that can be expanded, quickly compared to other modes, because they have quite long lead times. So what is the government asking us to do in the National Bus Strategy, albeit it is drastically underfunded at the moment? As I say, the 3 billion that was committed by the Prime Minister has been reduced to 1.2 billion, and all of the bus service improvement plans that all the local transport authorities nationwide were asked to put in added up to over 8 billion. So you can see that the ambition is not going to be realised, but the wish list at the minute is to make buses more frequent. So so they have turn up and go frequencies where people don't have to consult a timetable. To make them faster and more reliable, to make sure that when people do go out for the bus, that it turns up on time and that it gets people to their destinations when they expect it to get there. They want to look at buses being cheaper, especially for young people, to get into employment, because we know that's been a barrier as well. And indeed in Scotland, they've just launched a concessionary fare scheme, a bit like they do for the older people over 60 who can travel free of charge. Up to age 22 now in Scotland, you can travel free of charge, but there is no such scheme in England. But no, that's not to say they can't be developed. They want buses to be much more comprehensive, to make sure that they cover more areas of cities, particularly on orbital journeys as opposed to radial journeys. But again, demand for that is lower. And really, buses for to be easier to understand, so making sure that information is available to people through apps and potential signs at bus stops, just to again demystify what buses do. And they want buses to be easier to use, to give common tickets. So, for example, in Oxford, what we've done is introduced a tap on, tap off system, because again, people, if you tell people you have to get a smart card and you have to register for it and we'll post it out to you, we have to go to a travel shop to get it, that again becomes a barrier for people. So having just a debit card, which you can use for all your other things in life that you wish to purchase, we are introducing the government wants to see more of that, but in Oxford we've already introduced a tap on, tap off system, which caps out at £3 if you just use the park and ride system, £4 if you travel around Oxford City, £6 if you go to the sort of greater Oxford City, to places like Abingdon, £7 if you're travelling throughout South Oxfordshire, and £9 you can go anywhere across Oxfordshire. So again, we've tried to round the figures off, make it simple, and you can tap away and make as many journeys as you can. And the specification of buses as well, we need to make those appealing. So, if you get on the bus, it looks scruffy, dirty, unappealing, you're not really going to come back. So again, we've put a lot of effort into trying to make buses much more appealing visually, externally and internally, and we need to do more of that. Integration with other modes, as Ed touched on, he's going to be talking about the importance of integration as well. We need buses to be able to, people don't just necessarily use only the bus, only the train, only cycling. We need to make sure it's all much more better integrated. As I say, the government is making some money available to try and make that a reality. We need to make buses greener. So in terms of the National Bus Strategy, the Prime Minister said he wants to introduce 4,000 zero-emission buses as soon as he can. So there was a snappily titled ZEBRA bidding opportunity, which is zero-emission buses for regional areas. It must have taken ages to come up with that acronym. But Oxford has bid for 159 zero-emission buses, which hopefully will deliver to Oxford from the middle of 2023 and into early 2024. It's very challenging because there isn't actually a business case to do it, because a zero-emission bus costs about £450,000 to purchase, whereas a diesel Euro 6 bus would cost about £250,000. Plus, you've got all the charging infrastructure to put on top. So what the ZEBRA scheme does is it funds 75% of the difference between what you would pay for a diesel bus and a zero-emission bus. But of course, you still have to make up the 25%. And indeed, there has to be a business case to invest in that base diesel bus, which, as journey speeds have got slower, that's not necessarily been the case. But I'm pleased to say that both major bus operators in Oxfordshire and Oxfordshire County Council have worked together to overall invest 82 million in 159 zero emission buses, and we hope to hear back on that in March to see if that can proceed. We need to make sure buses are accessible and inclusive, and by design, to make sure that as many people as possible can use them. And we want buses really to be seen as a safe mode of transport. You know, we don't want it to be seen as something where people are apprehensive or concerned to get on. So that's broadly what the government's trying to achieve. Now, in terms of the future, you know, people say, well, are your buses ever going to be driverless, sort of thing? And can we do that? And really, we need to sort of park that to one side, really, because it's not. I'm definitely not anti-innovation, but there has to be a business case for commercial companies to invest in that technology. And I think that's where it falls down. Look, you know, people at the moment are doing lots of trials. They're trying to learn about autonomy and how it works. But ultimately, there needs to be a business case for commercial operators like me to invest in it. And at the moment, that's not clear. You know, so for example, the way I would look at autonomy kicking off is I spend a fortune every year on fueling and shunting my buses around the bus depot. Now, that would be a logical first step to say, well, actually, how can we automate that as a first step? You haven't got the complications of being on the highway and all the issues that come with that. So we very much want to innovate and move forward, but again, we've got to do that in partnership and make sure that there is a business case to do it. But similarly, if I'm now investing in a fleet of 159, or the bus operators investing in a fleet of 159 buses, they're going to have a 15-year life. So there's no point coming along in 5 years' time saying, well, I've got this fantastic autonomous bus that you can use because I've just invested we collectively invested 82 million in 159 buses. So again, it's you've got to pick the timing for when you're introducing the technology for buses to evolve. But we're definitely into innovation. But for now, the priority needs to be on building on that 4.07 billion journeys a year for buses, making sure that we can recover to as close to 100% as possible, accepting that working habits have changed, there's more hybrid working, etc. But if we aren't going to get those people back, we need different people to use the bus and get them out of the car to make sure that we can get back to running those services sustainably, reliably, punctually, and making buses the natural first choice to allow government to make progress on its journey towards net zero. So that's probably all I wanted to say this morning, Sara. So back to you, and hopefully that was helpful.
Lovely, thank you so much, Phil. And you know, as a fairly recent bus user since moving, you're right. I can spend £4.20 and bus around Reading to my heart's content. Whereas the same journey into Reading would take me the same amount of time as bus, but I'd spend 16 quid on parking plus the diesel. So, you know, it's a balance, and buses have changed an awful lot. And let's not go driverless. The drivers are all wonderful. We have had a couple of questions come in, but I will keep those to the end if that's okay, because I'm noting everyone's details down. Phil, thank you very much. I think we have next Ed Goose from GWR. If you wouldn't mind stepping up now, Ed, please.
Absolutely, and thank you, Sara. So lovely to see everybody this morning. I am Ed Goose. I am the Regional Growth Manager for Great Western Railway for our East region, of which the Thames Valley is obviously an integral part. And so it's great to be with you today. And I recently actually joined Great Western Railway from Transport for London, where I joined Transport for London as a surface graduate management graduate, which meant that buses was my sole focus when I first joined TfL. So I will obviously be looking at this talk today through a rail lens, but buses are very close to my heart, Phil. So you've set me up perfectly. And I think the message is we're working together to improve transport rather than being competitors so much. So I think there's three things that I just wanted to touch on today. Firstly, similar to what Phil mentioned, what have we seen during COVID and how has that impacted the way in which people are accessing Great Western Railway services? Secondly, some reflections on what this might mean for the industry, obviously focused on the railways, but sort of thinking about the wider industry part. And then finally, how do we adapt and thrive moving forward, including the companies, the likes of, Connected Kerb, Kawasaki, and the wider companies that are on this call. How can we work together to adapt and thrive to meet some of the challenges maybe that we've seen recently, and also, net zero and other issues that the country and the government are facing over the coming few years. So in terms of what have we seen, during and I like to say post-COVID, but as Phil says, we'll wait and see if that's the case. So, a few headlines, I think, from a sort of GWR perspective. Firstly, and I'm sure we've all seen this with our own travel and the own way in which we're behaving, but there's been a real big push towards localism. So we've seen that people are staying in their local area, they're accessing travel differently, they're maybe traveling more between smaller towns rather than traveling long distance. That's natural, I think, and we'll have to wait and see if that actually is a long-term impact, but that's certainly something that we've got to react to. Secondly, I think there's been an incredible change in terms of people not wanting to travel into London so much. Now, the network has been set up previously, as you'll see, with the Great Western Main Line and Crossrail and everything that we're doing to get people into London as quickly as possible and get them back out again in the evening. During the pandemic, that hasn't occurred. That has been a real big shift. And interestingly, Exeter, down in the southwest, travel in and around Exeter is now higher than it was before the pandemic on our railway services, whereas travelling to London is still only about 60% or so. So a real stark difference in terms of how people are travelling into London. Now, I live in London and I'm sat at home today, unfortunately, because there's a tube strike. So it shows that some things are way beyond my the control of Great Western Railway. Moving on, leisure travel. So leisure travel has become even more important. I'm sure it's the same for Phil in Oxford and as another great city, but we've seen the uptick in some of our southwestern areas. So obviously GWR covers beautiful Devon, Cornwall, Wales, sites that we all want to go on holiday to, especially last year. So we saw leisure travel up and over 100% at some points last summer, with people wanting to travel. And I'll touch on what that sort of means for us as an organisation moving forward. Interestingly, and linked to that, we saw that risk and people were clearly not wanting to travel, first of all, because they were told not to, but also because it was seen as a risky way of accessing, of moving around, public transport and shared spaces. But what I think the leisure travel showed was that quickly was removed, actually. My partner works in London, and she didn't go into the office for about a year, but she would travel in to past her office to go into the theatre or to go shopping at the weekends. And, so people weren't avoiding travel because they felt like it was too risky to. They were avoiding travel because they didn't want to. And there was a number of other factors that I'll touch on. Travel is coming back. So we are seeing travel rebound, and our business markets are starting to rebound, and we've seen season tickets interestingly start to increase since Omicron's sort of started to recede over the last few weeks. So that's positive. But the peak, I think I wrote down here, the peak has become more like a Yorkshire Dale. So we're certainly not seeing the morning AM and the evening AM in these sharp Matterhorn type rises. We're seeing that people are travelling more off peak, more 11 o'clock, 10 o'clock into London. Maybe coming home at 3 p.m. or maybe coming home at 7 p.m. So there's a number of factors for that, but we've got to obviously respond to that because especially our inter-London transport has been set up to get people into London for their 9 o'clock meeting in the morning. Now, that's not to say that those people aren't travelling. People aren't travelling at that time. It's just nowhere near as pronounced as it was before the pandemic. And then finally, I think one thing that we don't touch upon enough, and I think Phil mentioned it, was people have become aware of the cost of transport. People have had 2 years now where they haven't been paying £8,000 for a season ticket to get them from Swindon to London. So now with the cost of living crisis that we've got going on, people more risk averse to spend their money, everything else becoming more expensive, inflation, an all-time high, and fares on regulated fares on transport went up yesterday. Are people going to want to spend that amount of money to get into London if they feel like they have an alternative? So I think that's a few of the things that we've seen throughout the pandemic. And then in terms of what does that mean for the industry, I think first of all, and without wanting to sound too risk averse, I think there's an argument to say that, do we still need to understand more? Do we still need to know how COVID has it permanently affected the way in which people travel? So the example is, and I think Devon is a place very close to my heart, but once you can go to southern Spain easily without needing to test, and it's 29 quid to jump on a Ryanair flight, and you don't need to isolate, and it feels safe. Will people still want to travel to Devon for their summer holidays, or will we see people jumping back on an aeroplane and moving abroad? is London dead? You know, is commuting and the way in which it has been accessed in the past, is that over? I mean, I kind of hope London's not dead, because I've just bought a house and that would really impact me quite negatively. But you know, or are people just taking longer and longer to get back to the office? So I think we can't have radical change to the transport infrastructure at the current time in response to factors that are still, you know, we only got rid of all regulations, I think, in England as of 2 days ago. So, you know, we are still coming out of this pandemic, but there's definitely been change. But is it too early? And this is an open question. Is it too early to think that change is permanent? Secondly, and I think Phil mentioned this as well, I think funding of transport, public transport, needs to change, and we need to have an honest conversation in the UK about what that means. Now, a couple of examples on that is that as Phil mentioned, the political aspiration compared to the reality of what can be delivered with the amount of money that's being made available are two completely separate things. Now, there's been a lot of articles in the press recently about how railway operators are needing to cut their costs, and I won't speculate on that in this open and public environment, especially it's being recorded. But I think, you know, it's clear that we have got politicians and expectations that we will be able to offer the same service, but with considerably less funding. And I think an example of that, actually, and it was touched upon earlier, is Transport for London. So before the pandemic, Transport for London was the biggest and most major operator of transport in the UK that received no government grant to run its operational service in the whole world. And now we're obviously seeing a debate going on between the Mayor of London and the government about how TfL can operate with no government grant moving forward, clearly understanding that the government has pumped loads of money into TfL in the short term. But there does need to be an open, honest question about, in the UK, if we do want to get people out of cars, we do want to incentivise people to travel, we want people to come to buses and onto trains, is it subsidised, and how subsidised is it as a public service? Or are we expecting operators and the network to make an operational, to become operationally level, I guess, and that comes down to costs again. I think a couple of other points before I move on. I think there's more opportunities to look at stations. We're seeing people dwell more in our stations, you know, not wanting to just get the paper, get their coffee and jump on the train as quickly as they can in a 4-minute dash. People are spending more time at stations. That provides opportunity to the industry, whether it be electric charging, whether it be more retail space, whether it be more advertising, whether it be co-working spaces in stations, to look at stations being less about a way of getting people onto the networks, but actually a well-connected place. And I was at Didcot last week with the station staff there, and they say that now their commuters that used to come through and dash through they stop and have a chat and have a coffee in the morning and just get on the next train, because they are less fussed about getting into London quite so quickly. That provides a lot of opportunities for the industry to adapt stations. And you know, a lot of our stations, so you look at the likes of Didcot, you can easily get from Oxford, you can easily get from London, you can get from Bristol. You know, should they be where people come together to work more than everybody needing to get into London and back out? Interesting conversations for the Thames Valley as well there, I think. And I think the final point on what does this mean for the industry, I think there's going to be more of a political lens than there ever has been on public transport over the next few years, because public transport is going to be funded and subsidised in the short term, at least, by the government. And then, as we're seeing in London, as we're seeing with Great British Railways and the potential reform that's coming there, and I certainly don't have a mystic ball to say what that will look like in a few years' time, there is going to be a lot of political interest in the railways. So finally, and the last couple of minutes, I'm just going to talk about, how do then we as an industry adapt and thrive moving forward. I think, first of all, we need to make sure that customers have the best possible service at the current time that we can provide to get people out of their cars and onto public transport. If we're providing a bad service at this time, we are going to lose customers in the long term because other options will become available. Now, I think it's difficult to make buses and trains more attractive often than it is to make the car in a lot of circumstances, because on a winter's day, if it's peeing it down with rain and you've got to walk 10 minutes to a bus stop, jumping in the car and listening to heart radio or Radio 4, whatever people like to listen to in the warm, is often a lot easier way and a lot more accessible way for people to travel. And I use the example, I was down in Exeter at the weekend on Friday, and I looked to get the bus to a little village that was further away, the number 1 bus, and it was gone to a 2-hour service by that time of the evening at 6 o'clock. Now, that's not Phil's fault, that's not an operator's fault, that's an industry's fault that we don't think that there's a requirement for people to use buses at that time in the afternoon. So we've got to make public transport more attractive than cars, or cars have to be, or private transport, I should say, has to be regulated and has to be made more unattractive through local authority and government interventions, such as we've seen with the ultra-low emission zone in London and the congestion charge. They have to come together. They can't be separate. I think there's more opportunities for public transport to harness big data for a more reactive service. Now, especially with the trains, we can't be offering on-demand trains whenever people might want them and need them. That's not how the train service work. And, you know, we've seen with buses, that's incredibly hard to do. There are some potential opportunities for on-demand buses, but again, it's not easy to do. But can we provide a more reactive service? Do we need to be waiting every year for a timetable change? Or can we look at more niche ways in which people are wanting to travel and access travel? We've got so much data on how people are moving, and clearly integrated ticketing and tap on and tap off aids that, because you can see exactly when people are entering the system and when they're leaving the system. TfL has done a lot of work with that and a lot of Wi-Fi tracking and how do people move. There's opportunities, I think, for the wider industry to get on board with that, and I know that that's something we'll be looking at. And I think just a couple of other final points is that we should harness innovation. I think coming from my public transport and public sector hat at TfL, you know, it's difficult for a public sector to really want to harness innovation because it's not a natural thing to do. It's not, you know, we want to do it, but it's not easy to do. But I think that's when the opportunities come. Young people are going to expect us to have innovative forms of transport and to be offering that and to be looking to take that forward. And then finally, just on the point of net zero, I see this as a real opportunity for the public transport industry as much as anything else. I'm sure Chris will talk about the challenges of EV charging for private hire vehicles and beyond. We already are making public transport, you know, less carbon intensive. GWR has reduced by 40% its emissions since 2016 and 2017. That's electrification of the railway lines. That's what that allows you to do. It's possible, we do it, and it's expensive, and it's causes a lot of public debate, but it does have a massive impact on reducing carbon emissions, as do new trains. And the final point is just that not everywhere is going to be accessible for electrification, some of our branch lines, but we are looking at a battery train trial now on the Greenford branch out to West Ealing that will be coming online later in the year. And what that does is it rapidly charges up and then just drives up and down the little track as it goes and charges back up at the other end. So there's opportunities. We just need to be working together. We need to be harnessing innovation, and we need the funding there to be able to take these trials and take these opportunities and really hit the front foot to take that forward. Sara, I think I talked for a minute more than I said, so I will stop there.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Ed, and brilliant. Love to hear about that. And it's very true about space at stations. Maybe, you know, a shared office there is a good idea because people can come in. And it's a good opportunity, I suppose, to explore cars, motorbikes, all the various modes of transport that we use. Do we need all of them? I think I still need a car, but you're right about time. So I had a conversation with Phil the other day about my car broke down. So me getting to Winnersh, which is 16 minutes in the car, it's about 8-9 miles from me. But to actually do it by the 2 trains or the 2 buses and a train that I would have needed would have been nearly 2 hours. And you know, it's one of those conundrums, I suppose. Anyway, I'll leave it there, and if anybody's got any questions for Ed, please do put them in the chat box, and I will hand straight over to Howard from Kawasaki, if that's okay. Thank you, Howard.
Okay, Sara, thank you very much, and thank you to our 2 speakers so far, with some really interesting stuff coming out there. I'm going to talk to you more about personal transport, as you would imagine, but also about how manufacturers go about adapting what they make and how they make it in terms of the framework that's been laid out from government in the various documents. So as the brief to this seminar said, nothing's really changed very much for us in the last 50 to 60 years in the way that we actually move. We've always had cars, motorcycles, buses, trains and aircraft, along with the active forms of travel such as walking and cycling. But what of the future? What are we likely to see? Well, as I say, I'd like to look at two different areas, so vehicle technology and innovation, with a view to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and carbon emissions from vehicular use, and also how the type of vehicles that we use may evolve to solve some of the other transportation issues that we have, if there's a framework there to enable them to do so. So at the beginning, then, it's clear that the plan set out in the government's decarbonising transport document that the future of vehicles consuming traditional fossil fuels such as petrol and diesel is now very much time limited. And this alone will create fundamental change in the way that we move, and it seems likely that we won't be able to make those quick refueling pit stops in minutes, and that longer journeys will need to be planned more carefully. And whilst we as a manufacturer and indeed as an industry have no fundamental issue at all with the ambition to remove or drastically reduce emissions from road vehicles, we do feel that the plans laid out by government have been written in such a way as to stifle some wider innovation and to channel the move from fossil fuel directly to battery electric, providing very little opportunity to pursue other, perhaps more sustainable and longer term solutions. So we and many other manufacturers prefer to see a technology neutral approach, allowing and encouraging alternative technologies to emerge alongside battery electric, as no one technology is right for every type of application. However, there is a single phrase in the government's plans that is zero emissions at the tailpipe, and whilst that is extremely laudable, it does also pretty much stop in its tracks other technologies being able to emerge and prove their worth in the transport mix. I suppose the most fundamental issue with zero emissions at the tailpipe is that it appears to ignore life cycle analysis. And so, for example, it ignores emissions created from the mining and extraction of huge quantities of lithium, nickel and cobalt that are going to be needed to make lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. And depending on what mining techniques you use, you can be burning up to or anywhere from 5,000 to 15,000 tons of carbon emissions to extract just 1 ton of lithium. And a lot of that raw material extraction and battery manufacture is happening in countries that use coal as the prominent fuel for their energy production. In fact, there's a study undertaken by Science Direct on comparative life cycle CO2 emissions from the production of electric vehicles compared to ICE, internal combustion engines in China, and referred to by the RAC, that states that an estimated 14 tons of CO2 is used to manufacture an electric vehicle, as opposed to just 9 tons for the manufacture of a conventional ICE vehicle. Now, of course, this offset and more, depending on how many miles you drive, is made up once the vehicle goes into use, because there is nothing coming out of the tailpipe. Although, of course, ultimately CO2 used to generate the electricity that is used for charging should be added into that calculation. But here's a thought. What if you could use different fuels in an internal combustion engine that would drastically reduce its emissions or provide complete carbon neutrality? Now, the use of hydrogen as in an internal combustion engine as a combustible fuel is already possible. And when burned, it produces no unburned hydrocarbons and no CO2 emissions. But it does still produce nitrous oxide, or NOx, although at far, far lower levels than petrol or diesel engines do currently. With the use of exhaust technology, most of that could be captured, leaving very little to exit the tailpipe. Alternatively, there are some really exciting developments taking place in the production of synthetic fuel. It's a fuel that combines green hydrogen with carbon captured from the atmosphere to make methanol, which can then be further refined to create green petrol, diesel, or kerosene. And yes, there would be some emissions from the tailpipe when burnt, but they are less or equal to the carbon that was captured from the atmosphere during the production process of the fuel. So in other words, true carbon neutrality. And furthermore, synthetic fuel is a drop-in fuel, meaning it could be used in today's internal combustion vehicles or engines, and it could be delivered through today's existing fuel station infrastructure. Now, both of these options, however, whilst being pursued and developed elsewhere in the world, are unlikely to be utilised in the UK because they don't fit that single criteria, zero emissions at the tailpipe. Under current government framework, as a manufacturer, and we're trying to think of solutions to all this, there appears really only two options, which is battery electric, which we are all becoming very familiar with, and hydrogen fuel cell. Fuel cell vehicles are unlikely, or conversely likely, to remain at low levels unless investment into a fuel delivery infrastructure is put in place. And the elephant in the room with hydrogen currently is that the production of virtually all hydrogen at present is via a process called gasification, which uses coal or natural gas, in other words, fossil fuels. So in short, significant emissions are created to produce a fuel that will then deliver zero emissions at the tailpipe when used in a fuel cell. And ironically, that would fall within the government's current guidelines. What then of green hydrogen? The production of green hydrogen is possible using a process of electrolysis, using electricity produced by renewables. And this technology is still in its infancy, and it's currently far more expensive than gasification. But if we're serious about carbon neutrality, shouldn't it be supported and encouraged by the UK government in the same way as it is in Japan and other nations who see hydrogen as an alternative to sit alongside battery electric? Now, at this point, I think it's important that I'm not misunderstood. I'm not against battery electric, far from it. I think that technology has a huge part to play over the ensuing years, and Kawasaki as a company will soon be introducing a range of electric motorcycles, along with other exciting projects such as range extender hybrid technology, which has never been seen on motorcycles before. And as an engineering company working globally on a massive scale, and with so much resource and innovative thinking at our disposal, it seems a real shame that for the UK at least, some of the more sustainable long-term projects that could begin to get us close to proper carbon neutrality in terms of life cycle analysis will have to be abandoned due to a single criteria for use on UK roads. I think perhaps the point I'm putting forward is that during the headlong rush towards battery electric, due to it being the only current technology available or able to use zero emissions at the tailpipe in great numbers, are we really tackling climate change, or are we simply reducing emissions on our own roads, only for them to be intensified elsewhere? So zero emissions at the tailpipe and true carbon neutrality are two very different things. And after all, the collective goal is to save the planet, not just the streets of the UK. So for us, the change away from the single criteria of zero tailpipe emissions towards a technology neutral approach that will allow engineers to explore alternative solutions and allow them to gather pace and grow alongside battery electric with a view to proper carbon neutrality is something that we feel the government should be adopting. Now, I'm sure in the wider audience, and certainly even within this room today, there'll be very differing opinions on this, but I throw it out there as food for thought, if nothing else. So what then of us as individuals and how we move? Well, emissions are far from the only issue we have on today's roads. Even with battery electric, the huge issues of congestion, road space and parking will remain. And what about those people that are not able to charge cars at home? One car parking space with a charging point outside an apartment block may have owners of 10 or 12 cars all living above one another, but all needing to use it. And do we need a car for every journey? The average household in the UK currently has 1.4 cars, according to the Office of National Statistics. But we know in many affluent areas, such as the Thames Valley, it can be far more than that. So how do we reduce that need to continually use a car for every journey? And are there alternatives, and what might they be? At this point, I'm sure you're all saying, I'm going to say, buy a motorcycle, lower emissions, no issues with congestion or parking, great fun to ride. But let's be realistic, a modal or huge modal shift towards motorcycles is unlikely to happen in the UK for many reasons, not least of which is the great British weather, which was touched upon earlier. So I'll get off that particular soapbox and just broaden my scope a little bit. Now, in the government's decarbonising transport document, it suggests that journeys under 2 miles should be walked and journeys up to 5 miles should be undertaken by cycling. It's great for some people, But how practical is that really for the wider society used to living in the convenience of a car? And just to try and see what that meant, I tested it recently, and where I live in Frimley, in Surrey, is just over a mile away is a Sainsbury's local, and it's our go-to point when you just need to pop to the shop to get something you've forgotten. So I took my car, took me 3 minutes drive there and park, took 10 minutes in the shop, 3 minutes drive home again. Total time, 16 minutes. So I repeated the same trip walking. Now, according to Nike, it takes the average person 15 to 22 minutes to walk 1 mile. I was at the lower end, and it took me 16 minutes to walk there because it was all uphill. It took me 15 minutes to walk back. I spent the same 10 minutes in the shop. Of course, I had to carry my shopping home with me, and the total trip took 41 minutes, and for many, it would be far longer. Now, it's nice to think that the general fitness and health of the nation would improve by following our government's vision, but in the real world, how many people are actually going to do that regularly on a daily basis? So we need to find alternative solutions. We need to begin to adopt different modes of transport, such as lightweight powered vehicles that will allow us to live our urban lives without the need to use 2 cars or more. And beginning to emerge now, and in this case facilitated and enabled by battery electric vehicle technology, are a range of zero emission powered light vehicles. And as everything has to have an acronym, we call them PLVs. Now, these fall under the L category vehicle type, which has traditionally been regarded as motorcycles, scooters, mopeds, quadricycles, etc. But this category actually comprises of 7 different vehicle types, from scooters up to microcars, has the opportunity to innovate and provide solutions whilst meeting the government's zero tailpipe emissions requirements. So PLVs, I'm pleased to say, have been accepted as part of the government's future transport policy. The opportunities and benefits provided by PLVs have been highlighted in a comprehensive report produced by the Motorcycle Industry Association, working in collaboration with the government-supported ZEMO partnership. Utilising a platform comprising of 2, 3 or 4 wheels, PLVs enable urban mobility with significant advantages for those who do not have access for easy charging either at home or at work. Now, many of these types of vehicles will utilise a cartridge battery system that can easily be removed from the vehicle and taken indoors, charged either on a standard 3-pin plug or a bespoke fast charger while the vehicle is left outside. Smaller, lighter, and taking up far less space than a conventional car, urban mobility has the chance to evolve over the next decade to not only reduce emissions, but reduce overcrowding on our roads, taking up far less space for parking, and providing a solution for many who cannot currently easily switch to a larger battery electric vehicle. As a second vehicle, they can be an ideal choice. Certainly, they'll enhance green credentials and can be configured in many different ways. For private use, for transporting passengers for the school run and errands, such as I previously described. They can be left at the station to provide the first and last link of a public transport commute, or to enable mobility for university students. For business use, they can be configured for cargo, making them perfect for a last mile delivery, deliveries of smaller parcels, shopping, takeaway food, etc., with zero emissions and far higher accessibility than a conventional vehicle. Cost effective, easy to use, cheap to run. We may well see a switch towards this truly versatile type of vehicle as we move through the next few years, and more begin to come to market. But are people ready to make that switch? Well, we can see from the accelerating move towards battery electric and a similar pattern now starting to emerge in the smaller capacity sector of the motorcycle market, that public sentiment is there and early adopters have benefited from government subsidies to do so. However, it's a question, are the government as committed as they say they are to enable and encourage this consumer trend? Now, as an industry, we were highly encouraged in July of 2021 when the government adopted L category vehicles and recognised PLVs as part of the overall future transport strategy for the UK. Such encouragement, however, was short-lived when in December 2021, just 5 months later, without warning or consultation, government cut the subsidy available to purchasers of L category vehicles from a maximum of £1,500 to just £500, or a 66% reduction. And cars fared no better, with the subsidy being reduced overnight from £2,500 to £1,500, so a 40% reduction. So to wrap up, really, I mean, I wonder, having laid down a framework and a timescale that leaves very little scope for technical innovation for manufacturers and very little choice for consumers, just how committed are the current government to helping people make that move towards greener alternatives? How many years will people hang on to their diesel and petrol vehicles rather than making an early, or an earlier, I should say, fiscally enabled switch? Of course, I don't know the answer to that. I don't think any of us do, and that will play out for us all over the next few years. But it probably is a nice time for me to stop, and because it segues quite nicely into our next speaker, and I'll hand back to Sara to introduce them. Thank you.
Sorry, you're on mute.
Right, sorry, again, I should know better by now. Thank you, Howard. Really interesting. Yes, we need a less parochial attitude towards green tech worldwide. I'd love a motorbike, but hair, not my thing. Also, talking about carbon sinking, would I change my diesel car? I'm guessing the carbon has already been spent on building the thing and it runs fine at the moment. So do I need to change it? And therefore, and we sound like we've been horribly disrespectful to electric vehicles. And on the side of electric vehicles, I'd now like to introduce Chris Peakman-Jones, please, if you wouldn't mind stepping up now, Chris. Thank you.
Hi. I don't take it as anyone being disrespectful of electric vehicles. I think we all know there are compromises that have to be made. And I think we all know that there are pros and cons to most of these decisions. I suppose the angle I would take is that, and I also agree that we should all be out of our cars, and in an ideal world, we should all be walking or cycling or doing other things. But I think previous speaker Howard did a very good job of explaining why that isn't always realistic in many situations. I think what's interesting is when you look at some of the statistics out there that talk about the numbers of vehicles that are likely to be on the roads in future. So I think there's 36 million vehicles on the road at the moment. And there are forecasts that if everything goes well and we get vehicle sort of sharing schemes up and running, that organisations like Uber really take off in the UK, that you could get it down to 26 to 28 million vehicles. Still going to be an awful lot on the road. And so I suppose the agenda I have is to try and make sure that as many of those vehicles are as green as they possibly can be. Happily, I can say that the UK government seems to be on board with that. I agree that they are maybe a little bit behind in terms of supporting some of the innovation, particularly because of the timelines that they've set out. But they do seem to be on board with trying to drive this as quickly as possible, both in terms of the regulatory or the targets that they've set at 2030 and then ultimately 2050 for net zero, but also some of the regulatory change they're bringing in. So that 2030 deadline, but also the regulatory change around new build property, both commercial and residential, that's coming in this year to mandate that EV charging points have to be put out there. I thought, Howard, you made a really good comment on small micro vehicles. The point I'd say on that as well, which is I think really important, is they also have a significant cost implication. So smaller vehicles are also tend to be significantly cheaper than many of the large EVs that you see on the road. So not only is it a space issue, but also there's a real opportunity to see cheaper vehicles coming onto the road, which maybe means that people might be able to adopt them more quickly, rather than at the moment many people being excluded from it. Not everyone in society is excluded, but certainly if you're on a lower income bracket, then getting an EV just is not an option at the moment. And as much as people like me would talk about, well, yeah, there are company car salary sacrifice sort of schemes, that isn't open to everyone, and so you can't benefit from the tax savings. So those smaller vehicles are really interesting. So I've really enjoyed the debate so far. Just very briefly on, so I'm the Connected Kerb CEO. We're an EV charging business. Just a little bit about us, I'll sort of cover in a minute, but I wanted to just sort of put in context some of those targets to start off with. So the government's at the 2030 target and then the 2050 net zero target. The ability of hitting those, I mean, the targets are sort of almost irrelevant, right? We're either going to over exceed them and hit them early, or we're going to massively miss them. And the ability of hitting those, I think, is going to be driven by three things. So the provision of charging infrastructure or infrastructure that supports the transition, making it easy for people, the availability and the cost of vehicles and the performance of vehicles, and then finally the education piece. Now the first two are talked about quite a lot. The last one is very rarely ever talked about. So, and it's lovely to see a few people on the call that I know about, that I know, and a few of them are on sort of doing the same sort of thing as I am. So they'll get this. I'm a fanatic about EV, and yet I would argue that my family and friends are 2 years behind where the market actually is. So education is huge, and the government needs to do a lot more to support education. We all do need to as well. So on every single one of our projects, education is a big thing that we prioritise. The vehicle supply piece is an interesting one. So there's a huge wait list at the moment for vehicles, but it does seem to be being addressed. And maybe once the sale of all the existing assets that are sat in dealerships are out of the door, there'll be more encouragement to actually be going and selling EVs, whatever size they are, and whether those are the small vehicles or not. And certainly some of the big automotive manufacturers are, again, to Howard's point, bringing out some really interesting sort of vehicles. So the Citroen Amy, for example, very interesting vehicle, low cost, and perfect for cities, or certainly an alternative vehicle for cities. So the vehicle one seems to be being solved. The infrastructure one is really where we come in as a business. And the part I'd highlight on this is exactly as Howard and some of the other speakers have mentioned. If you don't have a driveway right now, you can't put a charging point on your driveway, and you are effectively, in our view, excluded from EV ownership. You are very, very unlikely to transition from owning a combustion engine vehicle to an EV if you don't have that option to charge at home, because this is all about convenience. If you think about your ownership of a combustion engine vehicle at the moment, you turn up to a petrol station, you pump the car full of petrol in 2 or 3 minutes and you're on your way. It's extremely convenient. If you own a charging point on your driveway, I'd argue that EV is even more convenient than that. And the problem is, if you don't have a driveway, it simply isn't. And convenience is king here. Convenience, affordability, and reliability seem to be the key things. So the affordability piece is another part, both in terms of the cost of the vehicles and also the difference between a home charging solution and a public charging solution. So public charging tends to be more expensive on the whole than you can get if you charge at home. So we're all about trying to tackle that. And then the final part is reliability. One of the negative parts of EV ownership at the moment is many of the networks are extremely poor in terms of their reliability. And again, if we want to see this as being a true societal transition to green mobility, we need to try and make that as convenient and as reliable, importantly, for everyone. Because unless people can rely on this and are confident in being able to get to work the following day because their car is actually charged, they are not going to switch out of their existing sort of petrol or diesel vehicles. So I just wanted to give you a bit of, just to sort of hammer home that message of the difference between on-street parking and off-street parking. And I guess maybe I'll come to the final statistic on this first of all. So 62% of the UK population can't home charge. Now, that is a higher statistic than you will have heard from many others. So the government talks about 40%, but they're actually overstating what they're talking about there. So they talk about 40% not having a driveway. It's actually lower than that. So it's only about 34% of the population doesn't have a drive, doesn't have somewhere, or rather about, maybe I'll start that again. So 34% don't have a driveway. The UK government talks about 40% not having a driveway. It's not quite as high as that. What they don't talk about, however, is people who do have somewhere to park their car, but don't have the ability to put a charging point on in that space. So they might have a dedicated parking space away from their home. They may live in a block of flats where they don't control the land downstairs. They actually may have some rights over there, but they don't have the rights to put charging points in. They don't have influence, those sort of things. So when you look at that at a national level, it's about 62%. When you look in certain urban areas, so if you look at Glasgow, 87% of the population falls into that category. So this is a profound challenge. The problem I have with that as well is that it often or further entrenches some of the differences across society. So often it is poorer people who live in those areas who are less likely to have driveways. And again, it's those poorer people who have poorer air quality where they live and who often are traveling greatest distances in terms of commuting, and therefore who would benefit potentially from some of the cost savings that you can have from EV in terms of charging versus petrol, particularly at the moment. So that was the final one, just to put it into context of why this is really important. Now, the other data on here is from survey data that we did I think it's about 2 years ago now. We've got a new report coming out with additional data in it, I hope within the next couple of weeks. It's just going through the final designs. This isn't our data, as in we haven't created this. This was from polling of 1,500 people and interviews with 500 existing EV drivers today. So, let's click forward. 84% of all the respondents we spoke to thought the government should install more public charging infrastructure. I mean, a bit of a no-brainer, right? You want to have them out. What was quite interesting is there's a bit of NIMBYism that pops into this, though. So if you then say to people, okay, great, would you like one outside your house? Because of what they've seen on the streets at the moment, i.e. these massive big petrol pump style units, pretty obtrusive sort of bits of kit, they then say, well, no, I don't want that outside my house. What I'll hopefully show you in a second is how maybe EV can be deployed in a way which is less obtrusive, which is quite important for a country which is as blessed as we are with beautiful streets. What is interesting, though, is about the next two statistics. So 67% of those existing EV drivers, so the 500 EV drivers that we spoke to, told us they would not have bought an EV if they couldn't charge at home. That should hopefully reinforce to you the importance of that convenience and reliability piece. If you can't be certain that you can charge your car, you're not going to make a switch. So again, critically important for that 62%. And then the final one just to flag on here is, again, a bit of a no-brainer. 89% said they would be encouraged to buy an EV if they could home charge. So hopefully that just reinforces what we're talking about here. Public charging infrastructure is really important. And a measure for my success or our business's success is, I actually think, if you look at, for example, the smart metering rollout across the UK, where essentially it's a free service, it saves you money and all you have to do is take a day off work. I think there's a real opportunity for public networks to be so great, so fantastic in terms of the service that they provide users when they're charging their vehicles, that even if you have a driveway, you won't bother spending the £1,000 to have a charging point installed in your drive. You just use the public charging infrastructures that are in your local area. So just a little bit on what we're doing to try and tackle this. And I'll be brief on these ones because this isn't supposed to be a sales pitch. We're about 4 years old as a business. We are owned, we're UK owned. We manufacture everything in the UK and we make it out of recycled materials. We're the fastest growing UK network, we believe at the moment. We've got about 1,000 charging points installed and we contracted, that statistic's actually out of date now. We contracted about I think it's about 12,000 charging points now for deployment over the next couple of years. For context, the total UK market for EV charging, there's about 20 to 25,000 public charging points. So that hopefully gives you some context as to the successes that we've had. We will deploy 4,500 public charging points this year. So the network will get to about 5,500. We're actually in process of that. And I can talk to some of the contracts that we've got. Just to reinforce again, we're all about long dwell charging. Why this is quite important is we actually see EV charging as being a bit of a solution for some of the grid challenges that we have and an opportunity to try and get more renewables into the grid system. So at the moment, a lot of renewables are actually turned off when there's too much renewables going into the system. So UK government or grid ended up paying quite a lot of money last year to turn off wind generation when there was too much capacity in the grid. We think EV offers an opportunity to get around that. You can't deliver the services we're talking about in ultra rapid charging. Because in ultra rapid charging, it's all about how big is the pipe or how big is the cable that's pumping power into the car. You don't need intelligence in that setting. You just need to pump it as quickly as you possibly can. At our end of the spectrum, it's actually not about speed. It's about reliability, affordability, convenience, and it's about intelligence of charging. So how can you charge as intelligently as you possibly can, recognizing that most people will be plugged in for longer than we actually need to charge their car. So they're plugged in overnight or during the day when they're at work. And their car can probably charge in 3, 4 or 5 hours. The point is, because we've got them there for the longer period of time and because we know them because they're regular, essentially a home charger, but for on street, we can start to forecast their behaviors and we can start to modulate the charging in response to the power availability in the grid. Meaning that if it's a windy day or if it's a particularly sunny day, we can take more power from the grid. And equally, if it isn't, we can delay the charge over a longer period of time because the grid is constrained with having no impact on the user experience. So we've got an amazing project at the moment in Hackney, Shropshire, East Lothian and Glasgow. It's called Agile Streets, public project where you can go and learn about it if you want to. It's essentially you're bringing agile charging tariffs to public streets. So again, trying to reduce the cost of charging for users so we can save the user about 40% on charging their car, meaning that this year, actually, despite the energy crisis, we've reduced our energy prices if you go on to that. And at the same time, you're both reducing the cost to the user, but at the same time, you're also reducing the pressure on the grid. So that focus on intelligence is pretty key in our area. And then again, the convenience, affordability, reliability. If you deliver that, you win in our market, and that's why we're winning. So that you can read the 1 to 7 there. I suppose the part I'd sort of say is, so this is one of the sockets that we have. So our system is broken into a few different areas. So there's the below ground infrastructure, which is a node box, and then the charger that sits inside that node box. So the node box is a structural steel box that sits under the ground. And then as I say, the charger actually sits within that box. And then above ground, all you have is a socket. Now, the reason we've done that is it massively reduces the footprint that you have to have in terms of the above ground impact of the charging units. It also means that when someone drives into this, it takes me 45 minutes to an hour to replace the kit. And I only have to replace the socket at the cost of a couple of £100 versus some of the other charging solutions, which would cost us a couple of £1,000 to go and replace the kit, because you have to replace the whole thing because it's all above ground. So we've tried to design it in that way to minimize the impact and improve the reliability. There are lots of different socket types we can put on this. So whether it's just a bollard with 2 sockets in it, or whether it's in this one where we want it to be slightly more obvious to the user that it's there. So this is the Gecko, we have a Chameleon, we've got Limpet, and then we've also got a home charging solution that will be launched in a couple of months. And I think that's all I'm going to say. The only other thing I'd mention is when we deploy, we also put ducting in for fast fiber. So all of these are fast fiber enabled. So when we go and deploy our charging points, our view was, I think it was the Carlsberg advert years ago, talked about if Carlsberg were to do roadworks, they'd be the most efficient roadworks in the world. Our view is there are going to be, even on conservative forecasts, there needs to be about 500,000 public charging points to hit the 2030 target. Remember, the 2030 target is only to have new car sales EV only. So you still won't have all of the vehicles transitioned by that point. So 500,000 by then, that is a huge opportunity to try and drive efficiency into the deployment of infrastructure on street. So we put fast fiber out with these as well. It's quite important when you think about the scale of some of the projects that we've got. So just to run you through a couple of those. So in West Sussex alone, for example, we'll be deploying 7,000 charging points across the West Sussex area. We've got projects in Milton Keynes, in Barking and Dagenham, across the whole of Kent. We're putting in 1,000 charging points, hopefully over the next couple of years. It was a project that started as 600 and it's now looking to be 1,000. All the way in terms of this sort of conversation here, we've got projects that then extend all the way down to Swindon as well, where we have a flagship project with Barrett David Wilson Homes, which is actually where that photo is taken from. I won't talk about that because it's a bit braggy. Let's get connected. Anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I clearly remember that advert because it was a load of guys digging holes in the road, and someone said, "Oh, while you're down there, can I put in a electric wire or whatever it was?" It was some decades ago, I seem to remember, but I do remember it.
Yeah, and it ends, if you remember, with a priest trying to bury someone in it. And we don't go quite that far, but we do try and get as much as we possibly can in there.
Yeah, good. And actually, you know, cars have had a bit of a bad deal this morning, but cars are still needed, particularly if you've got, you know, a family. My children are grown up now, but if you have a young family and you go to work and then you get a call from nursery saying such and such is sick, of course it makes sense to do the 20 minutes in the car rather than your, you know, potentially longer commute. There have been a lot of interesting comments coming in over the chat. Phil Southall, thankfully, seems to have kind of answered most of them. It's probably me being a bit leery, just regarding, you know, costs and time. All I can say is thank you so much to my speakers. If anybody else in the audience, so my delegates here, let me have a look around and see who's. Tim, I think you were, my colleague Tim actually was quite vocal, I think, on the chat. Do you want to?
Well, actually, thanks, Sarah. I think Phil really answered my question, because I think I was thinking that, well, actually, because on your trip to Winnersh the other day, I had to come and pick you up, which meant that I had to come all the way from Wiltshire to pick you up, which is interesting, isn't it, really? But the question that Phil has answered really pretty well was, I was thinking about what's the impact on our streets, and I suppose perhaps if I look forward 50 years, actually, will there be less on the street? So therefore, your connected way of travelling, in the example to Winnersh from where you live in Reading, would it have been shorter and quicker? But actually, I suppose one other question that came to mind as well for me was actually in that hour that perhaps your journey time had been reduced to, perhaps the methods of transport would have allowed you to be more productive on that trip. So people are looking for different ways to work, sometimes from home, sometimes from an office. And that was where my thought was going, actually. Would it, I think Phil said in his answer about, you know, it's a lifestyle change as well. think it was more of a statement than a fact.
Yeah, no, thanks, Tim.
Yeah,
and it's very true. And, you know, in the day, my dad always used to fly to, you know, Scotland because he could get work done on an aeroplane, which couldn't have done if he was driving or on the train, indeed. We are running slightly short of time. Is there anybody else who wants to kind of chip in? I know, Ben, you were quite, if you're still there, Ben.
Laura, can I just respond directly? So there's a question that Kevin's messaged me directly on, but I thought it might be relevant for other people as well. So Kevin, if you don't mind, I might respond to the group as a whole. So Kevin's asked, how do you pay for the charging, and do I need yet another app? And I think that sort of highlights some of the frustration of most of us as EV drivers, that for every network you have to have an app. So we have roaming agreements with other networks where they will roam with us. So some of the big networks won't. They refuse to do to sort of operate in an interoperable way. The ones that do, so the likes of Osprey charging, we do have a roaming agreement with them. So if you're a member of Osprey, you don't then need to develop another app. The part I would say is there's a lot of negativity towards having apps on for charging infrastructure. The reason, just to be very clear, why we have one and we would like you to use it, is if you use it, we can then do quite creative things in terms of power. So if we don't have your data and you just do tap and go, we can't then manage power flow, because essentially all we know about you is you've paid, and therefore we just have to push power into the car as quickly as possible. In the use case where we're sat, your car will be charging overnight. It might charge in 2 or 3 hours. So we can charge it very, very quickly. The optimum, however, is to make sure it's charged by the time you come and collect it, not within the first couple of hours. Because if you plug in at 7 p.m, you're actually going to be charging at peak hours. Whereas if we can delay your charging until 1 or 2 in the morning and then charge it very quickly, those are the sort of things that we can do with an app. Now, by contrast, if you're on a motorway service station, I'm completely with you. You do not want to have to download an app every time you go to a different motorway service station. You want to be able to just tap and go and get on with it. So it sort of depends, I suppose, on the setting. So no, you don't have to have the app. You can pair with an RFID on ours. You'd obviously have to log it. You'd have to become a member of the system to do that, as in you'd have to provide us with some payment details so that we could do it. But you don't have to use an app when you're paying strictly, although obviously we'd like you to.
Thanks, Chris. And I think you touched on it there. It's all about data, isn't it, at the end of the day? And I think, Ed, you mentioned big data for, travel overall. Is that information widely available? If Ed's still there, are you there?
Hello, yeah, I am. I think, so interestingly, it very much depends on the parts of the industry. So, for instance, Transport for London have had a policy for the last number of years as a policy that was set by the managing director at the time, that was to make as much of its data available to the public as you possibly can. So you can go on their website and you can find out tons of data about how many people are traveling, where people are traveling to, from, traffic light data information about, whatever you might want. And the idea for that was that will then allow innovators to set up their own apps using the data that's available. So a real big change. I think for the wider industry, we don't have as many sources of data at the current time, because it's quite a lot more fragmented across the country as it is. So clearly we have different operators running different rail networks. We have a number of different operators running bus networks, and a lot of the infrastructure is owned by local authorities, which I think Chris has touched upon. So I think the answer to that is no, but there's a journey to go on to make sure that data is available more nationally and potentially locally, depending on what the future looks like. And I think Great British Railways and how that comes to be will no doubt have a focus on obtaining as much big data as possible and looking at it via the department as a transport holistic node, rather than looking at it saying, where did this person do their journey on the rail? You go, actually, where was their journey from start to finish, and how did they interact with different types of transport along the way, whether it be they drove their EV car to a bus stop to then get a bus to get a train. I think that's the really interesting and exciting thing. And clearly TfL are in a very fortunate position that they can do that and see both the bus and the rail data at the same time, as well as seeing how many people are walking across, certain traffic infrastructure interchanges, as well as what time the lights have changed and stuff like that. So I think there's going to be a move in the longer term to trying to set up the regulation and governance to allow big data to be more used. But I think that's something that I would really like to see as on a personal point, based on my experience.
Yeah, and I think it's important that, we are connected on that front. It's much the same as when you look at an app and it tells you where the traffic is, or the best, the optimum time to make that journey, via your Google Maps or whatever. Best time, it'll take you 40 minutes now, or 3 hours if you go later, that kind of thing. So the technology's out there, I suppose, but it's about
Sarah, it's Dave Parker down at Electromech.
Hello, Dave.
Hi there. I just wanted to enhance that discussion that our learned friend from Connected Kerb was talking about just now, with respect to payment. Whereas I totally agree with what he's saying, in current situation, the market must move towards a more agnostic and open to all payment infrastructure. Combining payment systems and the advantages of big data and estate management in terms of maintenance, etc., within a charging infrastructure is good, of course, but the two don't have to be side by side. And the government itself is already talking about making chargers open to all and accessible to all. And so really the two will come together. And what we're doing with the launch of our own company, Electromech EV, is tackling that side of things. So we historically have been experts in payment systems for about 30 years. So we're bringing that into the EV market now in terms of contactless, pin on glass, accessible to all, anyone that's got a debit or credit card. But also we're working with the back-end systems guys, the people that actually sit behind the apps, enabled to provide all those functionalities, including Connected Kerb with their apps and what they can do with theirs. So we're discussing with a number of EV charger manufacturers with respect to integrating standard payment systems, contactless, pin on glass, swipe, QR, and all of those things that pretty much anyone can have access to, but also not neglecting the advantages that the various apps have. So I think there's going to be a much more open landscape as we move on in terms of payment systems, and it won't be just the guys at the motorway service stations with the super rapid and rapid charging. So I think I do agree with Connected Kerb, but I think that we also need to look at it in a bigger picture with respect to what the customers want. What do they want? What are they looking for? And we need to adjust technology and make that customer experience a lot less onerous than it currently is.
Dave, you're absolutely right. And, I'm not even talking about electric vehicles here. How many car parks have I gone to? And it's not Ringo. I have to download yet another app to pay for my parking because nobody carries cash anymore. And you sit and hope that, you've got sufficient signal to download an app and all the rest of it.
Sara, so I don't disagree with anything that's just been said there, but let me just put it into context. So our users typically use our charging points 3 or 4 times per week on the street outside their house. Yeah. So it's not the same as a car park where you're going once and you have to download a new app, or a motorway service station. It's a very, very different proposition. And the proposition there is around trying to optimize their charging to make it as convenient as possible. To be completely clear, I don't care how the person pays. That's not how, we make money off the kilowatts that go through it, but I don't care whether it's Stripe or whatever it is that uses it. What I care about is optimizing the interface between what we do as a network and the grid. So if there's a better way of doing it, I don't mind, but I need to have the data to be able to manage our impact on the grid. Because the numbers of charging points we're putting out now, the amount of power that's going through them will have a really significant impact on power that's going through the grid. And so I need to be able to optimize it. And that's the difference between the sort of high power charging, where they have to therefore get huge connections to the grid, because they essentially, when you turn up, the user wants to be able to charge as quickly as they possibly can, and will not accept what the grid says in terms of power availability. In our setting, if you're plugged in for 12 hours, you don't care when your car is charging, because you're asleep normally, or you're watching Netflix, or you're working, or whatever it might be. So it's about being able to optimize that, and that's where you need the data. So some of our users won't want to use an app because they might be visiting their family members. Fine. In which case, there needs to be a quick way of getting through without having to download another app. But if you're my next door neighbors or whatever, and you're regularly charging and you're using the charger 3 or 4 times a week, the negativity around an app isn't quite there. So I'm with Dave on this needs to be led by the consumer, and that's what we're trying to do.
Brilliant. Thank you all. I'm very aware that we're running out of time, so I will thank my speakers. I'm sure they'll be delighted to hear from you directly. You've got their contact details if you want to kind of chat further or have any further questions. I'm sure none of them are averse to hearing from you, or indeed the rest of the delegates. Leading into, or kind of wrapping up, I suppose, this event, I've got Property Forum coming up on the 21st of April. Now, property might not be your thing per se, because this has been transport, but it does all link together. So, you know, we're talking about business parks. Is the infrastructure correct to be able to drive to business parks? Do people need business parks? Do we need office blocks? You know, how the workspace is changing. Are we putting enough charging points in, for instance? Is public transport servicing the new office space well enough? So have a look at that when it crops up. I think it's possibly already live. Sarah might have comment on that. And then again, also allied to this event, Excellence in Engineering, 16th of June. So this is encouraging our educators to look more closely at the sector as a whole, engineering, and of course, if it wasn't manufactured by or designed by nature, an engineer had a hand in it somewhere along the line. So I think we're going to be doing that live in Oxford, and you'll get to see around an educational excellence in engineering, or Centre of Excellence for Engineering educational establishment in Abingdon, attached to the Atomic Energy establishment. That's it from me. Thank you very much for joining. I will let you all get on with your day. You know, I'm very pleased that everybody's kind of been able to make some connections. There wasn't a pun, by the way. Thank you for your time, everyone.